Probably a
Yeah, he
bit too
came back
late
to
for him.
India when his mum was dying a couple of
Yeah,
times, and even then, it was under close guard from
yeah,
the
yeah,
British.
yeah. They couldn't let him know, what he'd lost.
Hmm.
Um, one of the other things in terms of the book, his daughter was actually in England at that time, which is Princess
Yeah,
Sophia, and she actually came in to some of the hospitals in the south of England where the Indian soldiers and Sikh soldiers were, and actually met them.
yeah.
And she, spoke Punjabi with them, so she was able to speak. A Sikh soldier writes home to say this, that she spoke Punjabi, and she gave him a
Wow.
pair of socks as a present.
Yeah,
I'm not sure
yeah.
what the significance of that was, but that was written in one of
Take
the
it. Right.
one of the soldiers wrote that home. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, going on at that time. The other thing I wanted to mention was that one of the things that the Sikh soldiers, we sort of touched it earlier, was about knowing anything outside of what they do know, as in the Punjab. So
Mm,
when they went to France, in between fighting, they were able to live with the French people,
right.
and what they were able to see um, was the scientific advantage and knowledge that the French had. Not information, scientific achievement, educational achievement, and not only of the people themselves, the women in particular. So at that
Mm,
time, that was a shock to them, that the women were educated as much as the men were, and the women
wow.
would do all the work because obviously all the men were out fighting,
Yeah.
and they looked after them. The French were actually treated the Sikh soldiers and Indian soldiers in particular very well, and that
Mm,
surprised them because obviously their British counterparts may not have treated them as well.
mm,
And they also met other types of people from all over the world in France. So the Western Front was literally a United Nations of people. They met, people as far from places as Vietnam there. African soldiers who were under the French, who were under the French colonies, French soldiers themselves. And they saw the way the French lived. They also on tours of Britain. The British liked giving tours when the Indian soldiers came over. They gave them a
mm.
medal, took them around London, showed him lots of places in London, and in England. They were shocked by the splendor. So you can imagine some of these soldiers coming from these dusty villages in the Punjab and being
Yeah.
shown, all this, wealth and splendor of France and England. What they realized was, and this was probably one of the most important things that they brought back with them, was that they were being denied their freedoms. They didn't know that necessarily. They may have thought it, but they didn't know the magnitude of
And
it.
denied their freedoms by who? But by the British or by their
by the
family?
British, by the British.
Right.
So they knew that
Right.
they were being controlled because look at the freedom these people have that we don't have that. So the soldiers actually took a lot of knowledge and information back to the Punjab. I did a talk recently, which you heard,
Hmm.
and there was a man who spoke to me afterwards, and he told me a great story. And he said to me that I talked about this thing about bringing back information from France, and he said to me in his ancestral village that his grandfather had built a school. I said, okay, that's interesting. He goes, he'd built that school because he'd gone to France and seen the difference that education had made and seen the
Wow.
children and the children were well educated and stuff like that. And he realized that if I want my ancestors and my children and my families to be the same, they need a school as well. So when he came back after fighting in World War One, he built a school, and I was like, I was so happy he was saying this thing to me. And he said to me, and you know what's great about it? Because it's still there. 100 years
Yeah.
later, it's still there. And I said, yeah. And here's so it's a perfect example of bringing something which should be normal, having a village school, but they didn't have their village didn't have one. There are probably multiple reasons behind that, but he brought back that knowledge, and brought it back to the Punjab. House
It's
building was
interesting how
another
the
one.
British allowed that as well, because I would have thought they wouldn't have wanted people to get educated to
Yeah.
that level to challenge their views or
Mm.
to understand what's happening in the real world. I thought they would have probably tried to suppress them or maybe send them back out to war of some sort.
Yeah, one of the things the what happened when they came back was a lot of soldiers. They were under the impression that they were heroes, or not necessarily heroes, but they were going to get something for what they'd done. In 1917, the British had promised the Indian people to share power with the Indian people, A lot of
Mhm.
people thought that, well, I felt that that was a recruitment tactic. That was in 1917. So actually, when you come back from this war, we'll give you some benefits. We might give you some land, we'll give you some gold, or you give you some medals.
Mm.
Not all those, and not all of those were, that all that stuff didn't necessarily happen. So a lot of these soldiers were disillusioned. And also, I think the First World War had a huge impact on the British as well. They realised that the Indian people are becoming more independent. And you think about it, 30 years later, or less than 30 years later, the British had left. So I don't think they probably were going to, sort of get down on people, stopping people from having schools at that point. I think there were more important things to worry about than that.
They probably
then,
saw it coming, and they
yeah,
thought maybe it was going to happen anyway.
before the First World War, I would imagine they would have done a bit more, stopping that sort of thing. And they controlled the schools, the major schools, like you've probably heard the Khalsa College or
Khalsa
Khalsa
colleges,
School.
yeah, they're popped up everywhere, haven't they?
Yeah, the Khalsa College. There was a massive Khalsa College back in the early 20th century or late 19th century, and the British ran that. They ran that. The principal was always be a British person, so they knew how to control things. So the the other thing I was going to say was I thought was really important. These disillusioned soldiers came back, and they didn't necessarily get what they thought they would get. Now these people, one of the other things I should have said before that was we talked about controlling newspapers and the flow of information. The other thing the British did, and in particular to the Sikh people, was that they controlled their religious shrines. So none of the major Sikh religious shrines, Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple, some of the other major ones in the Punjab, if not all of them, were all controlled by British appointed managers. So they weren't controlled by, for example, a Sikh. The Kartarpur, the famous one you probably heard of recently, where they created a corridor through to Pakistan. That was again another Gurdwara which was controlled by these. Well, they're called managers. They're called mahants is the Indian word.
Yeah.
And these managers, they were basically just look after money, and the British paid them to do that. So these Sikh soldiers would come back disillusioned, fighting for a cause which they didn't necessarily get what they want. Their religious places are under siege or under control by British appointed managers, and they started realizing that from those freedoms that we discussed earlier, that this isn't right. That something needs to change. So there was two movements which started after that, after the First World War when they returned. One was what they call the Gurdwara Reform Movement, which basically was from 1920 to 1925, and very much influenced by returning soldiers, which was to effectively get back the control of the
Gurdwaras.
of the Sikh of the Gurdwaras. Yeah, that went on for 5 years, and there was a lot of bloodshed. You probably heard the Jator morchas and stuff like that, where people every day, thousands of Sikh men and women would just walk to effectively march and rally,
to
protest, but not violently, which is actually quite interesting because you think that's probably not the Sikh way. We have lifted the sword, but those people, they just took beats, they just took hits.
But Sikhs are told as well, like, fighting should be the last resort. It shouldn't be the first port of action.
Yeah.
So I can see that.
And eventually, slowly but surely, the British started giving back the Gurdwaras to the Sikh people themselves. Ultimately, with the Golden Temple, and giving back the keys to the treasury and the Golden Temple, and those managers were all thrown out. The other movement was the Indian independence movement. So a lot of ex-Sikh soldiers and Sikhs generally would start thinking about Indian independence because they started to understand nationalism, especially after the First World War. Whereas previously, maybe being an Indian isn't necessarily something they would have thought about.
Yeah.
So the First World War has got a huge number of things that happened because of it. So just after, this is one of the most crazy things, is that only less than 6 months after the end of the First World War, when all these soldiers are returning, and actually a lot of soldiers are still out, still fighting battles, or still can't think of the right word, looking after places for the British, occupying forces. That's the word I'm looking for. They introduced some really terrible legislation, which is called the Rowlatt Acts, less than 6 months after the end of the First World War, Sikhs and Punjabis were not able to gather in large groups. They were basically not allowed. If they were taken to jail.
Why?
Because they decided that the Punjabi people were basically too rowdy, and we needed new legislation to stop these people in their tracks.
I mean, they aren't wrong. We are rowdy.
Yeah. I mean, it's a simplification, but that's basically what it was. I mean, there was some crazy things that had been done, like where you couldn't walk down certain roads. You had to crawl on your body through certain roads. And whether that was actually legislation is a different matter, but that did happen. There's pictures to prove that. And then obviously in April 1919, you think April 1919, end of the World War One was November 1918, so less than 6 months. You had the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar. So, and we know, some Sikh soldiers, ex-Sikh soldiers were killed there too. And that's where Udham Singh, obviously, who actually had fought in the World War One himself, saw what happened there, and he vowed revenge, didn't he? And on the governor, which he did a few years later. So the World War didn't really end there. It basically moved on. And interestingly, we mentioned the 20% figure. So at the beginning of the war, Sikhs were 20% of the British army. By the time the end of the war, they were down to 14. So obviously things have changed. I mean, it's not a huge amount, but things have changed.
Still significant, but
still things have changed. A lot of people had left. A lot of Sikhs had left. Left the Punjab. Many were coming back. There was also quite a few what they call conspiracies during the war period as well. There's a particular gentleman called Bhai Randir Singh. He wrote a book called Jail Letters, and just to read that book of what he went through during these war years,